Hello. This is the 22nd Sunday of the year. In 2018, that falls on September 2nd, just a day away from Labor Day, in case you have the day off. Anyway, this is the readings, or these are the readings, a little bit of a commentary, and even a smaller bit of a homily probably on these readings. The first reading is that famous one from chapter 4 of Deuteronomy. Moses said to the people, "Now, Israel, hear the statutes and decrees which I am teaching you to observe, that you may live and may enter in and take possession of the land, which Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. In your observance of the commandments of Yahweh your God, which I enjoin upon you, you shall not add to what I command you, nor subtract from it. Observe them carefully, for thus will you give evidence of your wisdom and intelligence to the nations, who will hear of all these statutes and say, 'This great nation is truly a wise and intelligent people.' For what great nation is there that has God so close to it as Yahweh our God is to us, whenever we call upon him? Or what great nation has statutes and decrees that are just as this whole law, which I am setting before you today?" The word of the Lord. The second reading is from the letter of James, that rather crusty conservative guy in the early church who gave us some of the best quotes we've ever had. But here's the reading from the very first chapter of James. "Dearest brothers and sisters, all good giving and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no alteration or shadow caused by change. He willed to give us birth by the word of truth, that we may be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Humbly welcome the word that has been planted in you and is able to save you. Be doers of the word, not hearers only, deluding yourselves. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." The word of the Lord. And the gospel is very interesting. It's Jesus complaining about people keeping human laws, but sometimes disregarding God's laws and the keeping of it. Afraid that we have this kind of cut up. We don't have the whole section. I'll refer to some of the pieces, though, that have been left out. When the Pharisees, with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the traditions of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed: the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" He responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition.'" He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. For within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." The Gospel of the Lord. I trust you'll be patient with me today. I'm at the end of an end-of-summer cold, and so I might have to blow my nose, as I'm about to do right now. And, pardon me, please. And might even cough once or twice. So please absolve me from the etiquette that I normally show when I do these. The problem that we have today is one that really came up during Vatican II, because Vatican II changed a lot of things around. And if you were like I am, growing up before Vatican II, there was not much of a distinction made between human regulations or laws and God's regulation and laws. We simply read what we had to do out of the Baltimore Catechism, and the Catechism rarely brought up that distinction. And this really came to the fore in the mid to late 60s when there was a Gallup poll, I think, or some poll, that asked an interesting question of Catholics. Which is the more important regulation, to give up meat on Friday or to love your neighbor? And a majority of Catholics responded, giving up meat on Friday is more important than loving your neighbor. Giving up meat on Friday was a human regulation, but I'm afraid practically no one made that distinction when we learned those regulations in school, at least in Catholic school. And so you have to ask, as they did in the early church, the same basic questions. Which laws can we dispense with? Which laws do we have to keep? Because all who originally followed Jesus were Jews. Jews kept the 613 laws of Moses that govern everything practically that they did in life. And yet when Gentiles entered the church, as they do very early, non-Jews, are they obligated to keep those laws too? And so you read in Paul's letters, pardon me please, the big debates in the early Christian communities about this. You had the Judaizers, as we call them today. These were the more conservative Christians. They said, yes, you have to keep all those laws even if you're a Gentile, which meant before you could convert to Christianity, you first had to convert to Judaism. Then you had people like Paul who said, no, if you're supposed to imitate Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus is a new creation. As he said in Galatians, he's not male or female, he's not Jew, he's not Greek, he's not slave or free. He's simply unique, this Jesus that we follow. So if you were following a Jewish Jesus, then maybe you should keep Jewish laws. But you're following something unique, totally different, as Jesus was regarded by Paul. But the question arises over and over again. Why do we follow some laws and not follow other ones, even the human ones? And in a way, the Deuteronomy reading today kind of answers at least part of that. That you follow laws because the laws guarantee you life. If they didn't guarantee you life, if you didn't have a better standard of living by following these laws, why would anybody be idiotic enough to follow them? And so that has to be in some sense a rule of thumb whenever we ask about, do we keep this law, do we throw this one out, do we maintain these? Do these laws give us really life? Do we live a more fulfilled, happy existence by following the law than by not following the law? And we're not talking about love your neighbor, divine laws from God. We're talking about human laws. For instance, laws in my lifetime that created all sorts of problems about birth control. Those regulations could change, and the majority opinion of the Birth Control Commission that Paul VI called together in the mid-60s basically encouraged it to be changed. They saw no reason why, for new reasons that they developed themselves at least, or discovered themselves, it couldn't be changed. But James even hits the nail on the head when he says, if I'm you, follow the basic things. Take care of widows, take care of orphans. You don't need any particular human regulations to tell you to do that. God tells you to do that. And Jesus, in Mark's Gospel, written probably about 70, says, as I just read a few minutes ago, that don't worry about all those other laws. They are external things. Just follow the internal. Now, Scripture scholars say the historical Jesus, the Jesus who lived between, say, 5 or 6 BCE and 30 CE, couldn't have said those words that are in today's gospel. If he did, Paul would have quoted him right off the bat. there would have been no argument with Judaizing Christians about Gentile Christians following the law. Jesus basically abolishes the obligation for Gentiles to follow the law. But by the time Mark's gospel is written, about 70, as I said before, that becomes the general practice in Christianity. Gentiles don't have to follow the law. So the risen Jesus present in that community, in Mark's community, basically can be quoted as saying, don't worry about following the law. One of the things left out of that gospel that I always go back into because it applies to my family. Jesus said that you were supposed to take care of your parents, your mother and father. But you say if your wealth or the money that you have saved up is declared as Karban, then you're off the hook. You don't have to use that money to take care of your parents. Now, Karban basically means dedicated to Yahweh. And please understand, every Jewish scholar that I know of says there is no record anyplace in Judaism that speaks about that Karban law in reference to your parents. They claim we Christians made up this whole thing, that it was never part of it, of Karban, or if it was, one little group of Jews followed this, but not everybody. But Jesus basically says the Karban rule is a human regulation. The taking care of your parents is a divine regulation. And I always tell my students when we're exegeting this or studying it, back in 1946, 47, I guess I was just a little kid, and my great-grandfather, John Baptist Salzik, was dying. And he was the father of my grandmother, Mary Karban, okay? And we were at his house, and I was kind of hiding myself or trying to look inconspicuous in a corner where this rather dramatic thing was going on. My grandmother was calling Springfield, where her sister, my great-grandfather's other daughter, was a nun. And my great-grandfather was dying in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Belleville. And she was trying to get permission for her sister to come home to be with her father when he died. Now, please, my great-grandfather, I learned years and years later, was not happy about his daughter Ida becoming a nun. He had great problems with her doing this. So much so he refused to call her by her religious name. He always simply referred to her as Ida, not Sister Norbertine, which was her given religious name. And on his deathbed, he is calling out for Ida. I suspect part of this could have been what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about as unfinished business, and he had unfinished business, obviously, with his youngest daughter. But the problem was the authorities of that religious community were telling my grandmother, your sister cannot come home. She came home a couple years ago for a visit when they thought your father was dying, but he never died. But I'm sorry, she used up her one chance to come home. And then why couldn't my great aunt come home for her father's death? Because she was a nun. She was consecrated to God. She was what Scripture refers to as Karban, which meant her dedication to God was more important than her dedication to her father. The irony was, my great aunt was also the supervisor, I guess, of the 7th floor in this particular hospital, which was a geriatric floor, which meant that particular night when my grandfather was dying, she was helping other people's parents die, and probably did a beautiful job in doing that. But somehow or another, the obligation to be a nun automatically superseded the obligation to care for your parents. I think basically what this particular incident showed me was, I think we should be taking care of parents before we do anything else. And basically the council said the same thing. Today, that same religious order in their retirement home for the sisters has special rooms set aside for parents if they cannot be taken care of any other way. And so we've done a total turnabout in there. But obviously the turnabout came about simply because people understood life is very important, and we should not use God as an excuse not to live as God wishes us to live, especially in our relationships with one another. Thank you.